It's 1945, the Pacific Theater where the fury of war has torn through islands, cities, and mines. The sun hangs low in the sky, casting an orange glow over the wreckage of a recently fought battle. The sounds of distant artillery fire still echo faintly across the jagged coastline, but for a moment the world is eerily quiet. In the midst of the devastation, a small group of Japanese women officers stands, surrounded by the remnants of their fallen comrades and their shattered uniforms. They are not combatants in the traditional sense, but they have been warriors nonetheless, nurses, signal officers, and logistical supports, all contributing to Japan's last desperate attempts to stave off defeat. Their faces, etched with exhaustion and sorrow, are set in stoic masks. They have seen the horrors of war and they know what awaits them now. The enemy is close. Suddenly, American soldiers approach. They are wary, weapons ready, prepared for another fight. The tension in the air is palpable. These women, who have spent years hearing of the horrors of the enemy, brace themselves for the inevitable: hatred, dehumanization, contempt. But instead, one soldier steps forward, offering something utterly unexpected. He speaks to them not with malice but with kindness. His words are simple. "We know this war has been hard on you too." The women freeze, unsure of how to respond. In their world, kindness from an enemy was unimaginable. Yet here it is, unbidden, and for a brief moment the noise of war fades away. The weight of years of hatred and propaganda seems to dissipate, replaced by a quiet, unsettled silence. It is a gesture that shakes them not just in their hearts, but in their very understanding of the war and their role in it. The involvement of women in the Japanese military during World War II was part of a broader, deeply ingrained societal expectation that women had a vital, albeit secondary, role to play in the empire's ambitions. While Japanese women were not generally seen as frontline combatants, they were integrated into various aspects of the war effort, from logistical support to medical care. Their roles were carefully crafted within the confines of Imperial Japan's rigid, patriarchal structure, where women were expected to serve with loyalty to the emperor and the nation. The country's wartime propaganda made it clear the strength of the Japanese nation rested on both men and women contributing to the cause. In the early days of the war, women's roles were largely confined to the home front, where they worked in factories and other war support industries. However, as the war dragged on and Japan's need for manpower grew, the role of women in the military expanded. Female officers were brought into medical units, administrative duties, and intelligence work. Some women became signal officers, radio operators, and communication specialists, positions that required a combination of discipline, intelligence, and a deep commitment to the war effort. The training for women officers was rigorous, often focused on both military preparedness and ideological indoctrination. The Japanese military viewed women as essential to sustaining the morale and strength of the fighting forces, even though their participation was always framed within the concept of traditional femininity. They were expected to serve with stoic devotion, supporting the men at the front while maintaining the highest levels of discipline and propriety. The women, while not expected to fight in combat, were trained to deal with the same hardships and dangers as their male counterparts. They served in field hospitals, communication posts, and administrative offices, and their sacrifices were meant to be as vital as those of the soldiers on the front lines. The reality for these women officers, however, was far more complex. They were caught between two worlds: the brutal reality of war and the ideological expectations of their society. They were often just as emotionally and psychologically scarred as the male soldiers, but their experiences were seldom acknowledged. They were expected to maintain composure, to fulfill their duties without complaint, and to never let the horrors of war break through their disciplined facade. Yet despite the heavy toll war had on them, the women officers rarely found a place to express their pain, frustration, or doubt. As the war entered its final stages in 1945, the women officers found themselves faced with the imminent collapse of their country. The once mighty Japanese empire was on the brink of defeat, and these women, loyal to their roles yet increasingly aware of the futility of the war, were caught in the eye of the storm. The fear of capture by the advancing American forces was ever present, but so was a profound internal conflict. Having been raised with the imperial ideology of the righteousness of Japan's cause, they found themselves in a world where that righteousness was crumbling. By 1945, The tide of the war had turned decisively against Japan. The Pacific Theater had become a grueling campaign of attrition, as the United States and its allies fought to reclaim territory taken by Japan, island by island. The battles had been costly for both sides, and Japan's defeat seemed imminent. Cities were being bombed into oblivion, and Japan's once mighty navy had been reduced to a shadow of its former self. The Americans, having secured key victories in places like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, were now preparing for a final assault on the Japanese homeland. For the Japanese, the war had become an existential fight, one that had reached every corner of the empire. It was clear that the Japanese leadership, including the military high command, was determined to continue the war, despite the growing realization that victory was no longer possible. The country was mired in a sense of desperation and hopelessness, and the civilians, many of whom had already suffered greatly from bombing raids, were increasingly caught in the chaos. For the women officers, the situation was grim. They had witnessed the collapse of Japan's imperial ambitions firsthand. They had seen the defeat of their comrades, and many had been forced to abandon their posts or retreat in the face of overwhelming American advances. Yet even in these circumstances, the women continued to serve, their duty never wavering despite the grim reality around them. Their faith in the imperial cause, once absolute, was now shaken. But the training they had undergone kept them in line, focused on their roles. As the war neared its final days, the Japanese military high command was running out of options. The United States had already begun its strategic bombing of Japan's cities, and the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were looming on the horizon. Despite the massive losses, there was still fierce resistance from the Japanese forces, and for the women officers, this created a moral dilemma. They had been trained to uphold the ideals of loyalty and sacrifice, but the horrors they had witnessed began to undermine the foundation of those beliefs. With the end of the war approaching, many of these women found themselves in a position they had never imagined. The idea of surrender, once anathema, was now being discussed seriously among their superiors. For the first time, they were forced to confront the reality that Japan was losing, and with it, the ideals they had fought for. It was in the midst of this collapse, as the American forces closed in, that the most unexpected of moments occurred. Amid the hate and brutality of war, where combatants were trained to see one another as less than human, American soldiers offered something entirely foreign to the women officers: kindness. In the midst of the brutality and violence that defined the Pacific Theater, where millions of lives were lost and entire cities reduced to rubble, there existed moments of raw humanity that seemed impossible against such a backdrop. For the Japanese women officers, who had been conditioned to serve without question, often in the most harrowing conditions, encountering the enemy, the Americans, under circumstances other than pure hostility was both jarring and profound. These women officers had lived through a war that had consumed their country, leaving them with the scars of both physical and psychological trauma. They had seen the worst of the human experience, the suffering of their comrades, the wounded soldiers, and the civilians caught in the endless cycle of war. Yet amid this turmoil, they were expected to suppress their emotions, to remain stoic, and to serve the empire with unwavering loyalty. As the war reached its bitter conclusion, these women were not just dealing with the realities of a collapsing war effort, but the silent, growing recognition that their entire world was crumbling. The ideals they had been taught to uphold, loyalty to the emperor, devotion to the nation, honor above all else, were now shrouded in the grim reality of defeat. When American soldiers, who had spent years fighting against Japan, began to offer kindness instead of the hatred and disdain they expected, it created a profound psychological shift for the Japanese officers. The women, trained to view their enemies as less than human, were now faced with an impossible contradiction. The soldiers they had been taught to despise, to fear, were reaching out to them, offering words of comfort rather than the contempt they had anticipated. The shock of kindness, of being seen not as enemies but as fellow human beings, was a disorienting experience for these women who had spent years within the rigid, dehumanizing structures of war. For the women officers, this act of unexpected kindness was a moment of profound emotional conflict. They were torn between their loyalty to their country, their duty to their comrades, and the overwhelming realization that they were, in fact, no different from the soldiers standing in front of them. The American soldiers, despite the years of war, the devastation and the violence, still saw the women not as symbols of the enemy, but as people who had been caught in the same destructive cycle of war. The gesture was simple, perhaps trivial in the grand scale of things, but to the women officers it was nothing short of revolutionary. It was a break in the mental armor they had built over years of military indoctrination and propaganda. The emotional toll of this moment was immediate. The women were visibly shaken, not just by the words of kindness, but by the dissonance it created in their minds. How could the enemy be so human? How could they, who had been taught that the Americans were nothing but savage invaders, show such empathy? The kindness, so unexpected, acted like a mirror that forced the women to question everything they had believed in. For a fleeting moment, the war faded away, and the enemy soldiers standing before them were not so different from the comrades they had left behind. For the American soldiers, the decision to offer such kindness was equally complex. They were not naive. They knew that the women officers had been part of the system that had waged war against them and their countrymen. Yet after years of battle, bloodshed and suffering, they were also acutely aware of the shared humanity that had been stripped from both sides. The American soldiers had, in some cases, lost everything: brothers, friends, and even their own moral compass. In the harshest of circumstances, many had come to understand that in the fight for survival, they were just as much victims of the war as their enemies. Offering kindness, a simple gesture of recognition, was not an act of surrender but one of moral clarity. It was a refusal to allow the war to define them entirely, a step towards seeing the enemy as human, not just the embodiment of national ideology. As the American soldiers extended their words of compassion, they too were faced with a difficult moral question. Could they maintain the ideological purity they had fought for, even in the face of such vulnerability? In offering kindness, they did not diminish the war's brutality, but instead elevated the human experience in the face of unimaginable violence. The simplicity of their words had a far-reaching impact on the women officers, as well as on their own understanding of the war they had fought. In that quiet exchange, humanity was brought back into focus. For the women officers, it was an unsettling realization. The war, the propaganda, the dehumanization, all of it was a construction, a system designed to keep them from seeing the truth. The enemy was not some faceless entity to be destroyed. They were individuals, struggling for their own survival, and in the midst of the wreckage, in that brief moment of kindness, they saw that the capacity for compassion had not been completely erased. The psychological toll of war is often spoken about in terms of physical wounds, broken bodies, and shattered landscapes. But perhaps more insidious, more lasting, are the wounds that are not immediately visible, the scars left on the mind. For the Japanese women officers caught in the final stages of World War II, the psychological impact of their roles, compounded by the intense pressure of their nation's collapse, created an internal conflict that could no longer be ignored. These women had been raised with the belief that their duty to the emperor and the nation was paramount, that to serve Japan in its time of war was the highest calling. Yet as the war dragged on, they found themselves confronting the reality of defeat. As Japan's once unassailable military machine crumbled under the weight of American advances, these women officers were forced to reconcile their loyalty to a country that was losing its grip on power, with the undeniable human cost of the war. The moral and emotional conflict they faced was immense. They had been taught to despise the enemy, to see them as less than human. But they had also been trained to uphold the ideals of loyalty and duty, values that transcended political or national lines. Then came the moment of kindness from the American soldiers, a moment that could not have been anticipated. For the women officers, it was not just a gesture of goodwill. It was a challenge to everything they had been taught. How could the Americans, the very people they had been taught to hate, show them such kindness? The cognitive dissonance this created was powerful and unsettling. These women, hardened by years of war and indoctrination, found their understanding of the world, their perception of the enemy, unraveling before them. The psychological impact of this kindness was profound. For many of these women, the war had forced them into a place of emotional suppression. Their duties had been so demanding and the stakes so high that they had been trained to disregard their personal feelings in favor of the mission. They had to push aside their fear, their grief, their guilt, all in the name of duty. But the American soldiers, in their brief moment of compassion, had pierced this armor. The women could not simply return to the old ways of thinking. The kindness they had been shown was a mirror that reflected the humanity they had long denied in their enemies. It forced them to question their beliefs, to confront the reality that the war had not been about defending a righteous cause, but about survival, and that in the end, all of them, Americans and Japanese alike, had been victims of that same war. For the American soldiers, the decision to offer kindness was equally complex. Many of them had lost friends, brothers, and comrades in the Pacific campaign. The brutality they had witnessed, the Japanese soldiers' fanatical resistance, the suicidal tactics, the kamikaze missions, had left a bitter taste. Yet as the war neared its end, some began to see the war as something far bigger than just a battle between nations. The destruction had been immense, the cost catastrophic, and in their final days in the Pacific, some soldiers realized that the enemies they had fought for so long were not the faceless monsters they had once imagined. The kindness was an attempt to restore something human in a world that had been dehumanized by war. For many American soldiers, this simple act was an acknowledgement that, even after the violence, the cruelty, and the death, humanity could still emerge. The psychological effect on both the Japanese women officers and the American soldiers who offered this kindness was significant. For the Japanese officers, the encounter created a lasting inner conflict. How could they reconcile this act of humanity with the years of indoctrination, with the horrors they had witnessed, with their country's ideology that taught them to view the enemy as subhuman? The realization that their enemies, the Americans, could offer compassion instead of hatred created an emotional fracture in the women, one that would remain with them long after the war ended. They had been taught to fear the Americans, to see them as destroyers of their culture and their way of life. Yet here they were, offering kindness and understanding. For the American soldiers, the encounter was a moment of clarity amidst the devastation. Many of them had lost everything in the course of the war. The trauma of combat, the deaths of comrades, and the unrelenting violence had left their souls battered and scarred. Offering kindness was not an act of weakness, but a quiet defiance against the endless cycle of hate. It was their way of maintaining their humanity in a world that had been relentlessly brutal. The emotional impact of this kindness, of offering something different, something that broke with the tradition of animosity, was felt deeply, though perhaps not immediately. In time, it would shape how these soldiers viewed the world after the war, as they returned to a world where their old enemies might one day become allies in rebuilding a shattered globe. For both the Japanese women officers and the American soldiers, this brief encounter was a turning point. It showed that even in the midst of the most brutal conflict, humanity could emerge. It was a moment of profound psychological reckoning for those involved. The war had not only ravaged their physical worlds, but it also left lasting scars on their minds. But through this act of kindness, both sides experienced a kind of emotional awakening, a recognition that their shared humanity transcended the brutal labels they had been taught to assign to one another. War is often portrayed as a battle between ideologies, as much as it is a struggle for territorial dominance. The ideological clash between Japan and the United States in World War II was one of the most intense and profound of the 20th century. On one side was the Imperial Japan, a nation steeped in centuries of tradition and guided by a deeply rooted belief in the superiority of its emperor and the righteous cause of its military expansion. On the other side stood the United States, a democratic nation fighting to preserve freedom and opposing what it viewed as an authoritarian, imperialistic empire bent on subjugation and conquest. Both sides believed they were fighting for survival, but their ideologies were worlds apart, shaped by distinct histories, cultures, and worldviews. For the Japanese women officers who found themselves caught in the final stages of the war, this ideological clash was not just an abstract political or military concept. It was something deeply personal. They had been indoctrinated into a system that valued loyalty above all else, a system that taught them to revere the emperor as a divine figure, and to see the United States and its allies as invaders, enemies to be crushed without mercy. These women had been trained to suppress their own emotions and doubts, to believe in the righteousness of their cause, and to serve the empire with unwavering devotion. They were part of a military structure that demanded complete loyalty, even in the face of overwhelming defeat. For them, the war was not just a battle for territory or resources. It was a fight for survival against a perceived existential threat to their nation's very identity. The American soldiers, on the other hand, had been taught to view the Japanese as a barbaric, fanatical enemy. Propaganda on both sides painted the other as less than human, a stereotype that dehumanized and justified the brutality of war. The Americans, having fought a protracted and costly campaign across the Pacific, saw the Japanese not just as soldiers but as a threat to everything they stood for: democracy, freedom, and the preservation of peace. The island-hopping campaign was brutal, with both sides suffering immense casualties. The Americans, in the face of such prolonged and violent resistance, had been conditioned to view their Japanese opponents with a deep-seated animosity. However, when the American soldiers approached the Japanese women officers and offered them kindness, it represented a moment of ideological rupture. It was not just a military gesture. It was a moral one. For the women, the gesture was completely at odds with everything they had been taught to believe. How could an enemy who had been vilified for years now offer something as simple and pure as kindness? The propaganda they had been fed for years painted the Americans as ruthless, dehumanized enemies. But in this moment, they were reminded that their enemies were just as human as they were. The American soldiers, too, were faced with an ideological conflict of their own. They had been trained to view the Japanese as the ultimate enemy, to destroy them without mercy. And yet, in the face of the war's end, in the face of exhaustion and moral fatigue, the decision to offer kindness to these women was a direct challenge to the ideology they had been indoctrinated with. In that moment, the soldiers realized that their enemies were not faceless monsters, but people who had been caught in the same destructive cycle of war, victims of a system that had been built on ideology and nationalistic fervor. This moment of kindness did not erase the deep ideological differences between the two sides, nor did it change the trajectory of the war. The ideological battle between Japan and the United States would continue to shape the post-war world, particularly in the Pacific and the broader geopolitical arena. But what it did, in a much quieter and more personal way, was challenge the rigid frameworks of hatred and division that had defined the conflict. It showed that even in the most polarized and dehumanizing circumstances, there was room for humanity to break through. For the Japanese women officers, the kindness offered by the American soldiers was a profound ideological challenge. It forced them to confront the propaganda they had been fed, the idea that their enemies were subhuman, that their deaths were justified in the name of national survival. The gesture of kindness made them see the Americans not as invaders, but as people who had suffered just as they had, who had lost comrades, who had faced the same dehumanizing effects of war. It forced them to confront the idea that perhaps their own nation's ideology, their own sense of righteousness, was not as absolute as they had once believed. For the American soldiers, the act of offering kindness was a rejection of the hatred that had been a central part of the war effort. It was a recognition that, after all the bloodshed, there was still a need for humanity, for compassion, and for healing. The war had not just been a military campaign. It had been a battle for the soul of humanity. Offering kindness to the women officers was a statement that, despite the years of fighting, despite the ideological differences, they were still human, and that the war had not entirely erased their capacity for empathy. In that brief moment of kindness, the ideological walls that had divided these two forces for so long began to crack. It was a moment of reconciliation, not in any formal or political sense, but on a deeply human level. It showed that even amidst the devastation of war, the human spirit could still recognize the value of compassion, of shared suffering, and of understanding. The Pacific War had been a relentless and brutal contest, one in which no quarter was given, where the ideals of both nations were forged in blood and hardened by years of conflict. For the Japanese women officers, the final days of the war were fraught with a sense of inevitability. The battles were still being fought, but victory was no longer a possibility. The very structure of the empire they had sworn to serve was on the verge of collapse. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, though still in the distance for many, loomed ominously over the final push by the Americans. It was in these last days of desperation, When hope was scarce and survival was the only remaining instinct, that the Japanese women officers encountered something so foreign, so out of place in the brutal machinery of war: kindness. It was a moment that would resonate with them for the rest of their lives, one that would undo much of the ideological conditioning they had been subjected to. It was simple, and it was profound. The moment came as the women officers, worn and weary from years of relentless service, were taken prisoner in the aftermath of a particularly fierce confrontation. The chaos of battle had left them vulnerable, their roles stripped from them as the advancing American forces swept through. These women, trained to fight and support in the name of a lost cause, found themselves faced with the reality of surrender, not as an act of shame, but as a moment of reflection. Their uniforms, once symbols of pride and dedication, were now stained with the dust of defeat. As the American soldiers approached, weapons in hand, the women steeled themselves for the cruelty they had come to expect from the enemy. They had been conditioned to expect harsh treatment, humiliation, interrogation, possibly even execution, should the situation demand it. After all, the Americans had fought through island after island, facing unrelenting resistance and the horrors of kamikaze attacks. The American soldiers were, in their minds, figures of vengeance. Yet as they prepared for the worst, the soldiers did something completely unexpected. Rather than harsh words or violence, the soldiers offered kindness. One of them stepped forward, and with a quiet but firm voice he said, "We know this has been hard on both sides. You've served with honor. You're human, just like us." In that moment, everything seemed to pause. The world around them, the wreckage, the sounds of war, then fell silent. The air felt thick with the weight of this unexpected encounter. For the Japanese women officers, the words felt like a sudden breach in the walls they had so carefully constructed around their understanding of the enemy. Here, in front of them, stood the very people they had been taught to view as ruthless, dehumanized invaders. And yet, they saw in their eyes not hatred or vengeance, but a recognition of shared humanity. It was not just the words, but the tone, the gesture, a simple act of decency in the midst of destruction. The women were stunned. They had never been prepared for this moment, never taught how to react to an enemy who chose kindness over cruelty. For the American soldiers, it was an act of empathy, one that broke through the ideological programming they had endured over the years of conflict. They too had been taught to hate, to fear, and to demonize the enemy. But in this moment, with the war winding down, the realization that both sides had suffered beyond measure forced them to reconsider their understanding of the conflict. For the Japanese officers, this encounter marked a profound turning point. The enemy they had been taught to despise, to see as less than human, had offered them not just a gesture of mercy, but a moment of understanding. The kindness shattered the rigid ideological walls they had lived within for so long. It was a moment of clarity, of reckoning, when they realized that their perception of the war and their role in it had been distorted. Their loyalty to the empire had driven them to fight for an idea that was crumbling. But this simple exchange of words reminded them that survival was not about ideology or blind devotion. It was about the people caught in the crossfire. The psychological shock was immediate. The women officers, who had been raised to suppress emotion and to serve without question, now found themselves facing a moral and emotional conflict that no military training had prepared them for. The kindness offered by the American soldiers was a challenge to everything they had been taught. How could they reconcile this kindness with the propaganda they had been fed for years? How could the very people they had been taught to fear and hate show them something as human as empathy? The ideological foundations they had built their entire worldview on were crumbling in front of them, and they had no choice but to confront the uncomfortable reality that war, as brutal and dehumanizing as it was, did not erase the fundamental humanity of those involved. For the American soldiers, this moment represented a quiet revolution of the spirit. The atrocities, the losses, the endless fighting had eroded their own understanding of the enemy. Offering kindness was not a concession or a sign of weakness. It was an act of moral clarity. In that moment, the soldiers realized that the war had not just been a battle for territory or ideals, but a war that had stripped them both, the victors and the vanquished, of their shared humanity. To offer kindness in such a setting was an act of healing, a way to reclaim something lost amid the carnage of war. For both the Japanese women officers and the American soldiers, this exchange was a turning point. It did not change the outcome of the war, nor did it erase the pain and destruction that had come before. But it did serve as a reminder that even in the worst of times, even in the most dehumanizing conflict, it was possible to find a glimmer of humanity, a moment when compassion could break through the walls of hatred and bring understanding to a world torn apart by war. The emotional and psychological impact of that unexpected moment of kindness reverberated deeply for the Japanese women officers long after the war ended. These women, who had spent years entrenched in the ideology of Imperial Japan, serving with unwavering loyalty and duty, now faced a profound internal crisis. For much of their lives, they had been raised to believe that their role in the war was one of honor, supporting the emperor, serving the nation, and defending the ideals that defined their country. To offer kindness to the enemy was not just unheard of, it was a direct challenge to the very foundations of their worldview. In the immediate aftermath of the encounter, the women were left in a state of stunned silence. The soldiers who had been their enemies for so long had not only spared them, but had acknowledged their shared humanity. In a conflict that had been defined by brutal dehumanization, where the enemy was often portrayed as subhuman and deserving of nothing but destruction, the American soldiers had broken the mold. This act of kindness left the women grappling with a psychological paradox. The enemy they had been taught to despise, to fear, had shown them the compassion they had never expected. The internal conflict that followed was intense. For many of the women officers, their loyalty to the empire had been an unshakable force, their identity rooted in the belief that they were fighting for a righteous cause. But now, with the war lost and their cause in ruins, they were forced to question everything. They had been taught that the Americans were ruthless invaders, that they were the embodiment of evil. Yet in the face of defeat, the very enemy they had feared and hated had shown them kindness, respect, and understanding. It shattered the psychological defenses they had built over the years, forcing them to confront the deep contradictions in their beliefs. Some women found it difficult to reconcile this act of kindness with the propaganda they had been fed. How could they accept that the enemy, whom they had been taught to loathe, could show them such empathy? For others, the moment of kindness was a painful reminder of the futility of the war. The cost had been enormous, not just in terms of lives lost, but in the emotional and psychological toll it had taken on everyone involved. The war had shattered families, destroyed communities, and left lasting scars on the minds of those who had fought it. For the women officers, this encounter was a bitter realization. They had fought for an ideology that had been corrupted, for a cause that had ultimately led to their country's destruction. Some of these women carried the memory of this moment with them for the rest of their lives. In the years that followed, they would look back on the war with a sense of sorrow and regret. They would reflect on the kindness shown by the American soldiers, and in that reflection, they would often find themselves questioning the very values they had held dear for so long. The memory of this act of compassion was a silent rebellion against the ideological conditioning they had undergone. It was a reminder that, in the end, the war was not about ideology or nationalism, but about people, human beings who had been caught in a conflict far larger than themselves. For those who survived the war, many would go on to live in a world where the old ideals of loyalty to the emperor and devotion to Japan's imperial ambitions were no longer relevant. Japan's surrender in 1945 marked the beginning of a new chapter, one that would involve reconstruction, demilitarization, and a deep reevaluation of the values that had driven the country to war. For the women officers, this process of post-war reflection was deeply personal. Some found solace in the belief that the war had ultimately been about survival, and that the kindness shown by the Americans had been a small but significant reminder of what was still worth saving in the human spirit. The moment of kindness between the American soldiers and the Japanese women officers was a small, almost fleeting interaction, but its ripple effects were far-reaching, especially in the context of post-war relations. While the immediate consequences were personal, shaping the lives of those who experienced it, the broader implications of such moments contributed to the larger process of post-war reconciliation, a slow and often painful journey for both the Japanese and Americans as they sought to rebuild and redefine their relationship. For Japan, the end of World War II marked the beginning of a profound transformation. The once mighty empire was in ruins, and the nation was forced to confront the full extent of its actions during the war. The devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the destruction of entire cities, and the suffering inflicted on millions were undeniable. The post-war years were defined by occupation, demilitarization, and a re-evaluation of Japan's role in the world. The American-led occupation, under General Douglas MacArthur, played a critical role in shaping Japan's post-war identity, introducing reforms that transformed Japan's political, social, and economic structures. Yet amid this transition, the emotional and psychological toll of the war remained. For many Japanese citizens, particularly those who had been directly involved in the military, the war's end brought a deep sense of disillusionment. The ideological constructs that had defined their lives, the devotion to the emperor, the belief in the righteousness of their cause, had been shattered. For the women officers who had served in the military, the post-war years were marked by a process of reckoning. Many struggled with feelings of guilt, shame, and loss as they sought to come to terms with their role in the war. The war had asked them to suppress their emotions, to serve without question, but now, in the aftermath, they were left to process the emotional and psychological cost of their actions. In this context, the unexpected kindness of the American soldiers took on a new significance. It was a small but powerful symbol of the possibility for reconciliation and healing. In a world that had been ravaged by hatred, this act of compassion, though brief, demonstrated that there could be a way forward, a way to rebuild relationships that had been shattered by years of animosity. It served as a reminder that, even in the darkest moments of history, humanity could find a way to connect, to recognize the shared suffering that had defined both sides of the war. For the American soldiers, the end of the war brought its own set of challenges. They returned home to a world forever changed by the conflict, one that was struggling with its own questions of morality, justice, and the costs of war. Many veterans faced difficulties in readjusting to civilian life, as they carried the psychological scars of combat, from trauma to moral injury. The emotional weight of having fought in a war that had claimed millions of lives, including the lives of those they had fought against, was a burden that would not be easily shaken off. The kindness they had shown to the Japanese women officers, though not widely known or recognized, was a reflection of the larger moral questions that haunted the post-war period. In a time when the world was trying to come to terms with the scale of the war's devastation, and with the horrors that had been perpetrated on both sides, the act of offering kindness was an attempt to reassert something essential, that, in the end, the human spirit could survive even the darkest of times. It was a subtle rejection of the ideological divide that had defined the war, a recognition that despite the suffering, the capacity for empathy and understanding still existed. In the years following the war, the relationship between Japan and the United States would evolve dramatically. The early years of the occupation were marked by suspicion and resentment, but gradually, as both nations rebuilt, there was a growing recognition of the importance of cooperation. The United States, having once viewed Japan as a mortal enemy, began to see the country not just as a defeated foe, but as a potential ally in the rapidly changing post-war world. As Japan recovered and transformed into a democratic nation, the U.S. played a key role in helping Japan rebuild its economy and re-enter the global community. However, the journey toward reconciliation was not without its challenges. For many Japanese people, especially those who had served in the military, there was still a lingering sense of shame and guilt. The kindness shown by the American soldiers to the women officers in those final days of the war was not forgotten, but it was not widely discussed in the immediate aftermath. It was a quiet act, one that didn't make headlines or form part of the official narratives of the war. But for those who had experienced it, it became part of the larger story of post-war healing. For the United States, the act of kindness offered by the soldiers to their Japanese counterparts also marked a shift in the moral and psychological framework of post-war America. The soldiers who had experienced the cruelty of battle and who had been taught to view the enemy through the lens of hatred and dehumanization were beginning to understand the war as a tragedy for all involved. Their willingness to extend compassion to those they had fought against was not a sign of weakness, but of moral clarity. It was an acknowledgement that even in the worst of wars, humanity could still break through, if only for a moment. As the world emerged from the shadow of World War II, It was not just cities and economies that needed rebuilding, but relationships between nations and people. The war had torn apart not only physical landscapes but also the very fabric of human connection. The atrocities committed by all sides, the loss of millions of lives, and the ideological fervor that had fueled such violence left scars that would take generations to heal. And yet, amidst the ruins, moments like the unexpected, kindness between the American soldiers and the Japanese women officers stood as quiet reminders of the enduring strength of the human spirit. In a conflict defined by brutality and dehumanization, where enemy soldiers were painted as mere objects of hatred and violence, the act of offering kindness was radical. It was a rejection of the very narratives that had fueled the war. Narratives that reduced people to symbols of nationalism, of race, of ideology. When the American soldiers offered simple, compassionate words to the Japanese women officers, it was not just a fleeting moment. It was a challenge to the hatred that had consumed both sides. In that small act, there was the recognition that, beyond the uniforms and the propaganda, there were people, human beings with the same fears, the same hopes, the same capacity for empathy. For the women officers, the encounter shattered their rigid ideological constructs. Raised to view the enemy with suspicion, to believe that the Americans were invaders who sought to destroy their way of life, they were confronted with a truth that was far harder to accept. Their enemies were human just as they were. In the brief silence following the soldiers' words, they found themselves grappling with an emotional and psychological reckoning. Their loyalty to the empire had been absolute, but the war, in its tragic conclusion, forced them to question the very foundation of that loyalty. In offering kindness, the American soldiers had forced them to confront the hollowness of the ideals they had served and the shared humanity that transcended national divides. For the American soldiers, too, the moment was transformative. The years of fighting had been marked by a steady accumulation of loss, fear, and grief. Many of them returned home from the Pacific Campaign haunted by what they had witnessed, their sense of self altered by the violence they had endured and inflicted. Offering kindness to the women officers was a quiet but powerful act of reclaiming something essential that had been lost during the war: empathy. It was an acknowledgement that the war was not simply a contest of ideologies, but a tragedy for all involved. By offering kindness, they rejected the rigid narratives that had defined their own perceptions of the enemy, recognizing the need to heal and rebuild, both within themselves and in the world around them. The broader significance of this moment lies not in its impact on the war's outcome, which was already determined, but in the way it subtly challenged the dehumanizing forces of conflict. The war had pitted nations, ideologies, and peoples against one another, each side convinced of its own righteousness. Yet in the face of such division, humanity still found a way to break through. It was a reminder that even in the most brutal of times, small acts of kindness can create ripples that reverberate far beyond the immediate moment. As Japan and the United States slowly rebuilt their relationship in the post-war years, it was not just diplomacy and politics that shaped the New World Order. It was also the quiet recognition that, despite the scars of war, there was room for compassion. This moment of kindness shared between two former enemies became a symbolic stepping stone in the long and difficult journey of reconciliation. It was not an instant transformation, nor a magical solution to the wounds inflicted by the war, but it was a beginning, a reminder that, even in the face of the worst atrocities humanity can endure, and compassion can still have the power to heal. In the end, this simple act of kindness offered by American soldiers to Japanese women officers encapsulated the essence of what it means to be human. It was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, compassion can shine through. The war may have torn the world apart, but in this quiet moment it was a small step toward rebuilding the connection that all wars seek to destroy: the recognition of our shared humanity.